Service members of Reddit, what is your worst military wife story? As a military spouse and former DoD employee working with the Marines, I once received a call about a tragic situation. A military spouse, 9 months pregnant, had reportedly been assaulted during a break-in at her on-base housing. She was harmed, essayed, and taken by ambulance to the hospital, where the assault allegedly caused a miscarriage. Devastated, I rushed to the hospital alongside several officers from the Marines' chain of command. While there, one of the nurses tending to her looked me in the eye and said, "I'm very interested in how this is going to play out." I was confused by her reaction, until the truth came out. Upon being admitted, the woman underwent an ultrasound and blood work. The results were shocking. She had never been pregnant. There had been no assault. Her supposed due date was the very next day, and she had been faking the entire pregnancy. In a desperate attempt to cover up 9 months of deception, she beat and cut herself, then fabricated the assault and miscarriage story to avoid admitting the truth to her husband. I've never seen this level of crazy until 3 months later, when said Marine reunited with bat-crap crazy girl even after all that. Story 2. I had a friend, let's call him Robert. Robert was the kind of guy who always looked bummy and sloppy. He was the target of jokes and, honestly, he only got by because he was a genuinely nice guy. As lazy as he was, most airmen would cover for him just because he was kind and easy to get along with. Being a nice guy really goes a long way in the military. Now, Robert had an unexpectedly stunning wife. She was way out of his league, and it surprised everyone who saw them together. We all assumed that either Robert had some serious charm, or that his wife wasn't like the rest of us shallow people. I'm not entirely sure how it started, but Robert had a best friend named Greg. One day, after a few beers, Robert thought it'd be a cool idea if Greg slept with his wife while Robert watched. Greg was objectively better looking than Robert, so this was definitely a surprise to everyone. It happened, and then it happened again. This went on a few times until one day, after finishing with Greg, Robert's wife told him that she no longer wanted to sleep with him and only wanted to sleep with Greg. As you can imagine, this really upset Robert. So, how do I know all this? Well, one day, Robert came into our squadron for a mental breakdown. I was there trying to get some leave paperwork signed when he suddenly unloaded the entire story to our leadership. He ended it with a demand that Greg be punished. Of course, Greg wasn't punished. They told him to stop, but knowing Greg, that probably didn't happen. No one was really punished, and in true military fashion, the story spread faster than his wife's legs did for Greg. Gossip runs hard in the military. Story 3. Posting on behalf of my husband. The worst situation we heard about involved a platoon sergeant returning home after a 15-month tour in Iraq. He came back to find another man living in his house, with his wife and kids. His toddlers were even calling the guy daddy. When he walked in, his wife casually told him, "Yeah, I want a divorce. I'm with him now." To make it worse, the platoon sergeant and the new daddy had actually worked together. He was one of the few who stayed behind for clerical duties while the rest of the unit was deployed. Yes, I know this is completely against the rules. This was back in the days when things were pretty chaotic, and a DUI was almost a requirement to make E6. I asked my husband what happened after that. He said he doesn't know what happened to Jody, the deployment replacement daddy. The husband threatened to take the kids and kick her out on the street, which he had every right to do. But instead, she agreed to on-demand banging, including 3 scores, and even offered to summon a working girl if he wanted one, all while helping him keep it a secret. Story 4. This wasn't me, but it's a story about another dependent back in the early 90s when my husband was stationed at BRAC. He went over to a good friend's house for drinks and cards, and I stayed home with the kids because I couldn't stand the friend's wife. Turns out, I was right to feel that way. So, my husband, his friend's wife, and 2 of her friends were hanging out drinking and playing cards. Then, my husband's friend got called in for duty because they needed a jump master. He knew it was coming, so he wasn't drinking. My husband, however, had a few too many and couldn't drive home, since we lived a bit of a distance from BRAC. No problem. His friend told him to sober up and hang out until he was good to drive. So off he went. Now, it's just my husband, the friend's wife, and her friends. My husband switched to drinking coffee. A few hours later, one of the women left, and the other needed a ride home. Since my husband was pretty much sober by then, he offered to drive. The wife offered to go with them, so my husband wouldn't be alone with her friend, who was unmarried and, according to the wife, a slut. Yeah, right. The next morning, I was fuming because he walked in at 5 a.m. after saying he was just going out for a few beers at 7 p.m. the night before. He explained what happened and told me that one of the women had said to him, "I know you're married, but I'd love to lock you in a room for 2 hours and bang your brains out. He refused to tell me which one said it. So I went to the friend's wife, not suspecting her, and told her exactly what I'd do to her friend if I found out who said it. 6 years later, after my husband got out, I found out that it was the friend's wife who had said it. I also found out that she had been sleeping with anyone in uniform as soon as her husband left the house. No, my husband didn't take her up on her offer. He just thanked her for the compliment. About 5 years ago, he reconnected with the friend who had divorced the wife. He told the guy what had happened, and when my husband apologized for not telling him sooner, his friend said not to worry about it. Apparently, my husband was the only one of his friends to turn her down. I saw a lot of shady stuff going on when we lived at Bragg and Off Post, but this was the one time another dependent messed with my family. Story 5. There was a guy in my shop, Air Force, who deployed to Iraq for 4.5 months. Before he left, he signed over general power of attorney to his wife. While he was gone, she started seeing another guy from our shop. Then, she used the power of attorney to sign the divorce papers and gave up his rights to see his kids, all while draining his bank account. She moved in with the other guy from our shop and his friend off base. They both got arrested for fraud checking when they tried to cash a check from the roommate at the shophead on base. In the end, the guy she divorced got full custody of the kids, and the guy she was seeing got kicked out of the Air Force. There were plenty of other cheating stories and messes, but this one really stands out. She actively worked to ruin his life when all he did was love his kids and get deployed to Iraq. The lesson here? Never give anyone the general power of attorney, no matter how much you trust them or think they love you. You can give them specialized power of attorney, but only for the specific things you need them to handle. Just don't make that mistake. Story 6. I got tricked. Married an already married woman and lost everything. I was stationed at Pensacola NAS for some training and, as a 21-year-old, I made the stupid decision to date. I met a girl off base, and we started a relationship. She constantly said she didn't like military guys, but was all over the fact that I was in the military, which should have been a red flag. She pretended to be the perfect girlfriend, agreeing with everything I liked. Whatever hobby I mentioned, she'd say, "Oh my gosh, I'm into that too." She even claimed to work as a FEMA office manager when I told her I joined the military because I wanted to help people. After 4 months, I got orders to move to Cannon AFB in New Mexico. I told her I had to leave soon, and she started hinting that she wanted to come with me. Thinking everything was great, I agreed. We moved to New Mexico, and I rented a place for us. I was supposed to be living in base dorms until I ranked up, but things went downhill right after we settled in. She suddenly had no interest in doing anything I liked, and her attitude soured. She said it was just nerves from moving far away. 2 months later, I got chewed out by my captain for living off base without authorization. I explained my situation, and the captain told me to either send her back or get married. So, yep, we got married. We stayed married for 9 years. The entire time, she was miserable to be around and refused to get a job. I ended up supporting her entirely. Turns out, she had a GED and only had experience working as a receptionist at a trailer park. She lied about the FEMA job. Right before our 9-year anniversary, she begged me to leave the military and move back to Florida to take care of her grandfather after her grandmother passed. I stupidly agreed. Once in Florida, it turned out her grandfather was perfectly fine. We barely saw him, and after 2 years, I realized she had been cheating on me. I threw her things out, and she moved in with her boyfriend. Apparently, she wanted to go back to Florida to hook up with some guys. She had gained a lot of weight during our relationship. When I met her, she was 140 and blew up to 350 within 2 years of us being together, and by this point, I had no interest in her. Plus, she was an awful person. I initiated a divorce, but she wouldn't cooperate. She and her boyfriend broke into my house multiple times, looting it. I'd buy groceries, and they'd be gone the next time I came back. The cops and even my landlord wouldn't do anything because we were still married. I decided to move, and she found out. While I was at school, she cleared out my house. I confronted her at her place, and she called the cops. They believed her, and I was accused of burglary and battery because she could cry on command. I ended up taking a plea deal for a felony with 3 years of probation. My lawyer convinced me it was the best option. During this process, I discovered that she was never legally married to me. She was still married to a career criminal in Michigan. I had spent almost a decade supporting her, and she had used her military dependent benefits, all while being miserable. She was never actually my legal wife. My probation officer felt bad for me, and after 1 year and 5 months, I was able to get off probation. The charges were lessened, sealed, and eventually expunged. She never faced any consequences for committing bigamy and fraud, a class felony. Florida won't help because they say New Mexico has jurisdiction, but New Mexico won't do anything because she's out of state. Story 7. A guy in my platoon had a wife who falsely accused her ex-MP boyfriend of SA. She went as far as stabbing a mattress and swallowing a condom to try to set him up. The guy ended up spending weeks in jail before all the charges were dropped and he was cleared. When the truth came out, it turned out it was all just a vindictive scheme from the crazy lady, but she wasn't done yet. She handed her and my platoon mate's baby through a window to a friend while they were watching a movie one night. When my platoon mate went to check on the baby, it was gone. This prompted the first ever Amber Alert in Alaska's history. She tried to pin it on the ex-MP as an act of revenge, and I can only imagine what was going through his head when the cops showed up with that accusation. Luckily, he was quickly ruled out as a suspect, and they found the baby safe not long after. Story 8. While delivering our fourth baby at a military hospital, we were chatting with one of the nurses about infidelity and some of the wild situations she had witnessed. She shared a story about a woman who came in with her husband for an unscheduled C-section. The woman was adamant that she was scheduled for the procedure that day. To double-check, the doctors performed an ultrasound, and to their shock, they discovered she was only 3 months pregnant, not 9. It turned out she was willing to deliver the baby 6 months early, just so it would appear that the timing of the conception lined up with her husband's mid-tour leave. Story 9. A friend of mine came home a day early from a year-long deployment, eager to surprise his wife. He walked through the door, expecting a warm welcome, but instead, he found her on the couch, busy with another man. Stunned, he barely had time to process what he was seeing before he heard a noise from the bedroom. Curious, he went to check, only to find a baby lying in a crib. Confused, he turned back to his wife. "Whose baby is this?" he asked. That's when the final blow landed. She had never mentioned the child before, and to make matters worse, the baby wasn't even fathered by the guy on the couch. It was from a third man entirely. Story 10. There was this one time when a group of wives from the Midway, mostly from the Philippines, were running a working girls' ring out of base housing. On the nights they were working, one would watch the kids while the rest worked at Club A, using their homes as, well, services for the clientele. Quite a few husbands ended up coming back early from that deployment. Then there was the guy stationed on Diego Garcia, who was being counseled about not paying his bills back home. During the counseling session, a notice from Navy Relief arrived, saying that his spouse in Subic had been repeatedly asking for emergency loans because he wasn't supporting her. Turns out, he had married a girl in Subic in a church ceremony, just to sleep with her, and then completely cut contact. Meanwhile, he had a wife and kids back in the States. Definitely one of the worst military spouses I've heard of. Not a wife, but still a mess. He was flown off the island in less than 48 hours. Another story involved one of our older guys who went home on leave and came back married to an exotic dancer. He brought her to the base, and she showed up wearing a gold Krugerrand diamond ring that she'd gotten from a previous husband. We were hosting a party for some reservists at my apartment when she got a bit too bold. One guy joked, "Kiss my bottom," and she responded, "Bear it." Next thing we knew, she hopped on a low table, pulled down her clothes, and spread her legs wide. I immediately kicked her out of my place. She ended up cheating in the afternoons with a guy from Midway, and they weren't even married a year yet. Our guy sent her back to the States, but our command still made him come in for muster on the day of her pack out. By the time he got back, she had taken everything, leaving only his clothes. She later turned up pregnant with twins, but he could never prove they were his. Not sure if the other guy wised up or not. Story 11. So, I was in the Navy and my husband was a civilian. We got married young, like a lot of service members, at 19. We grew up in the same city and had been dating for a few years, so I thought I knew him really well. Sure, he had some anger issues, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary for a 19-year-old guy. I deployed to Afghanistan shortly after we married, and that's when everything started to go downhill. Some other base wives spread a rumor that I was sleeping around in porta potties, which was completely false. But that was enough to set him off. At some point, he started doing drugs, then selling to other base wives. Things got even worse from there. He trashed our house, sold everything in it, and drained my account, including thousands of dollars of my deployment money. He eventually left the base and disappeared. My 2 dogs were left behind in the house, causing more damage, and I had to pay hundreds of dollars to get them back from the Humane Society. Meanwhile, he was off base hanging out with a Japanese girl, and they ended up getting pregnant. When I returned, things escalated. He started following me around and threatening me. We eventually got divorced, but his mother, who was just as crazy, continued to harass me for years after. All in all, it was a pretty awful experience. I'd give it a 4 out of 10, and that's being generous. Story 12. This all happened over the course of 3 deployments, each lasting about 3 months, spread across 2 years. On my first deployment, I came back to my wife in a massive stack of mail. Among it were 2 repossession notices for my car due to non-payment, 3 final utility shut-off notices, and a letter from the landlord. I decided to tackle the car situation first because I really didn't want it repossessed. I went to our joint bank account and found it completely drained. No bills had been paid in 3 months. When I asked her what had happened to all the money, she simply said, "I went to Waffle House a lot." During the second deployment, I returned to find our house overrun with animals, 4 dogs and 3 cats. The outside trash can was sitting right in the middle of the living room. And, to top it off, there was a homeless guy sleeping on my couch. Apparently, she had taken up volunteering at a local animal shelter and felt compelled to save all these animals from being euthanized. The backyard was a complete mess with no grass left, thanks to the dogs digging up the yard. The carpets were shredded from the cats, and there were piles of dog poop, hardened and petrified, scattered throughout the house. When I asked about the trash can, she said it was just too hard to take the trash out. As for the homeless guy, she explained she met him at Waffle House, and he just needed a little help. By the third deployment, I came home to find that my wife had 2 new male friends. After spending a few months hanging out with them, a different female friend of mine let me know that my wife had been cheating on me with these 2 guys. When I confronted her about it, she said she only blew his dong because it was Christmas and she hadn't gotten him a gift. Story 13. My brother-in-law has been on both sides of some pretty messed up cheating stories. First, when he was 19, he married a woman he'd been chatting with online for a few weeks. Soon after, he had to deploy to Iraq. About a month later, she told him she was pregnant. He came home 6 months later, and she had the baby, except the baby definitely wasn't his. Fast forward 10 years. He's now married to a great woman we all like. She works a job and takes care of everything at home. But then, he cheats on her with an 18-year-old girl who works at Sonic. She finds out, so she leaves for the weekend to stay with her sister and figure things out. When she comes back, he's packed all her stuff into cardboard boxes and left them out under the carport, while he's moved the new girl in. Story 14. I've got some interesting stories from a friend of mine who worked as a midwife on an Air Force base and delivered a lot of babies. One day, a colonel brought in his 16-year-old daughter, who was pregnant. Turns out, the father was a new junior enlisted guy. Needless to say, he didn't last long in the military. Another story involved a guy whose wife left him while he was deployed. She moved in with her boyfriend off base, and she got pregnant. Even though they were separated, they were still technically married, so she kept going to the base for medical care. Their divorce wasn't final by the time her due date came around, so she was still able to deliver on base. But her soon-to-be ex-husband, the military guy, had some friends in security forces, and he made sure to put a security flag on the boyfriend. That meant the boyfriend couldn't come on base for the birth of his child. And of course, there was the classic situation where, at least once a year, a baby would be born with the wrong ethnic background compared to the father. Always a favorite for the gossip mill. Story 15. Our neighbors, 2 stories they shared with us. 1. A unit deployed, and while the husband was overseas, the wife met a new guy. She used power of attorney to divorce her husband, then married the new guy so quickly that she was able to stay on base in the same house. When the first husband came home, he ended up in the same platoon as the second husband, who was now living in his house, with his kids and all his belongings. The second story, when we first moved onto base, we had a super friendly neighbor. She told us she had cancer, so her brother was staying with her to help take care of her. We didn't think anything of it. A few months later, they moved out to live off base. It seemed like a normal thing, so we didn't question it. Fast forward a few months, and while I was shoveling the driveway, a guy from next door came over to say hi. I welcomed him as a new neighbor, but he wasn't new. He'd been living there for a couple of years. I was confused and asked about the woman who had recently moved out. He told me that the woman was his wife, the brother was her lover, and she didn't have cancer. She spent all his money playing Farmville and then moved out with everything they owned. Story 16. I was pretty naive and ended up in a couple of sketchy situations. First, somehow, I ended up alone with a colleague's wife. She started telling me some sexual stories and getting closer to me. Then, out of nowhere, she says something like, "Nobody gives better BJ than me." It was odd, but made sense in the context of the conversation, though it was totally unnecessary. My somewhat tipsy response was, "All right then, good night. I'm leaving now." The second situation happened when I was drinking with a different colleague. He got really drunk and, out of nowhere, started accusing me of trying to sleep with his wife, which wasn't true at all. I quickly dipped out of there. Later that night, the wife showed up at my apartment, saying she was there to quote-unquote apologize. I heard some other rumors, but I never knew what to believe. Story 17. My uncle isn't a service member, but he's an NCO. His first wife cheated on him with a colonel's wife. One day, he walked in on them in a very compromising situation at his house. So, he did what anyone would do. He kicked them both out with any clothing, right in front of the other people living in military housing, including the colonel. He ended up getting a divorce and full custody of the kids. Story 18. One evening while I was on staff duty, my then-wife decided I was cheating on her instead of actually being at work, which I was, never cheated on her. She sent me a text saying, "I'm going to go to the barracks and sleep with the first soldier I see." At that point, I was so checked out of the relationship, just waiting for the right time to leave, that I didn't even bother responding. She showed up at the barracks and tried to check in, but CQ turned her away because she used her dependent ID and couldn't tell them who she was visiting. Story 19. I'm an Air Force and Navy veteran, and I'm also a Marine wife. This happened to be one of my husband's Marines. We received a call to go to the family and assist with whatever they needed for temporary lodging. We had no idea what kind of disaster we'd be walking into. The worst experience I've ever gone through was the death of a beautiful 5-month-old baby girl. The parents were both avid gamers, and the wife struggled with mental health issues. They were both incredibly ignorant and negligent. One day, the wife became frustrated with the baby crying and not sleeping, so she propped the bottle on a pillow, used more pillows to cushion it, and left the baby alone in the master bedroom while she and her husband continued gaming. Tragically, the baby suffocated. Neither parent checked on her for over 12 hours, claiming they thought she was just sleeping. When they eventually went to check on her, they found her lifeless and left her there for several more hours. They tried unsuccessfully to resuscitate her while on the phone with 911. According to the police and EMS, rigor mortis had already set in, and it seemed like the baby had been dead for over 24 hours. But instead of immediately grieving or seeking help, they went back to their game to finish their match or whatever they were playing. The mother showed no remorse. In fact, she seemed more fascinated by how popular she was becoming on social media. She was so excited about her newfound local fame that she openly said her child's death was worth it for the attention and the GoFundMe donations. The father, the Marine, was indifferent through it all. Story 20. Let me tell you about my brother's story. He's in the Air Force. One day, he goes to work like usual and comes home to find his wife's car gone. He doesn't think much of it at first, but then he walks inside, and the place is a complete disaster. Clothes everywhere, appliances in weird piles, and a ton of stuff missing. The washer, dryer, fridge, their bed, the couch, you name it. What really freaks him out, though, is that their son is also missing, along with a bunch of his things. His son was about 5 or 6 at the time. Now he's really panicking. There's no note, nothing to explain where anyone went. He tries calling his wife, but her phone's off. He calls her family, no answer. Then he calls their mutual friends, but no one knows anything. That's when he calls the cops, reporting that he thinks they've been kidnapped and mentions that her car's missing, too. Remember this part, it comes back later. The police come over, take a statement, and right then, his wife finally calls him. She tells him she's staying with her family and that they're getting a divorce. She's also gotten a restraining order on him, saying that he's abusive and violent, which he's not. Later, she admits to him that she lied about it, but her lawyer told her to do it for custody reasons. The worst part? She knew when he would come home, and she waited until 45 minutes after he got there to call him and ruin his life. Their son was fine, but still, the damage was done. The restraining order caused trouble at his job, and he was completely blindsided by it. Keep in mind, this is a guy who served 3 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. This shook him up way more than anything he faced overseas. A few days go by, and they start working with lawyers to sort things out. But remember when he reported her car as missing? She used that against him in the custody battle, saying he was being malicious and trying to scare her. The judge actually sided with her, and my brother got punished for filing a bogus police report when he thought they'd been kidnapped. No joke. Her lawyer was way better, and she came from a rich family that got her top-notch legal help. She took him for everything, even the house she abandoned. But she didn't move into it. She just evicted him and then sold it for way less than it was worth. It took my brother years to get back on his feet mentally and financially. He retired after 20 years in the military and is now rebuilding his civilian life. He has a great relationship with his son, but his ex-wife continues to cause him pain and misery. Still, my brother handles it like a pro. He always says, no matter how tough or demanding she is, I've been through way worse just by being in the military. My brother's an absolute legend. His life's had its share of ups and downs, mostly downs, but he keeps pushing forward. I respect him more than anyone else, and without a doubt, he's my hero. Love that guy. Story 21. While working as a gate guard in Washington, D.C., an officer's wife drove up, presented her ID, and I waved her through. Instead of proceeding, she remained in place and asked if I had forgotten something. Confused, I told her I didn't think so. She then pointed to the blue sticker on her windshield and informed me that I had failed to salute her. Without missing a beat, I leaned in, saluted the sticker, and wished it a good afternoon. Not long after, I was removed from that duty. Story 22. I had a really good friend, and I knew his family well. I was one of the few people they trusted enough to leave their kids with. My buddy, Rick, decided to take the kids to visit his parents for a week, while his wife, Fiona, stayed behind to focus on college. Since Rick asked me to stay at the house while he was gone, I did. Fiona decided to invite a few of her college friends and some of the guys Rick and I worked with over for a weekend gathering. This wasn't uncommon. Rick's house was a popular spot for the crew. That night, we all drank a bit too much, and eventually, I ended up laying down on the couch. A few people left, but a few stayed. Around midnight, I got up to use the bathroom, which was attached to the master bedroom. I was drunk, so I left the lights off. As I stood there, I heard noises coming from the bedroom, moans, whispering, and the unmistakable sound of a squeaky mattress. I froze. Fiona was with someone. I quickly did a head count and checked the cars outside, and I figured out it was one of our crew members. Let's call him D-Head. The next morning, I was in a complete daze, not sure what to do. The days went by, and eventually, Rick came home. I decided to wait and see if Fiona would confess. 2 days later, it was announced that D-Head, who was being discharged from the army, would have a going-away party at Rick's house. That was when I knew I had to tell Rick. I drove to his place, and when I got there, Rick was in the garage with one of his sons, working on his dream car. Fiona came out, and they both asked what was up. I told them I needed to speak to Rick privately, and I saw that flicker in Fiona's eyes. She knew I knew, and I was about to spill it. She tried to tell me that we were all close enough friends that I could say whatever it was in front of her too, but I insisted it was something too personal and sensitive. Fiona went inside, and I took Rick to the curb where I told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Are you sure? Are you 100% positive? It couldn't have been anything else?" I told him there was no doubt. Fiona had cheated, and the man they were honoring that night was the one she slept with. Rick went inside, and I could hear yelling, banging, and muffled curse words. About 10 minutes later, Fiona came storming out, yelling at me to leave and never come back around her, their family, or their house again. That day really hurt, and I haven't had a close friendship like that since. It broke up the friend group and made work miserable. The kicker? That same night, while Rick was dealing with everything, D-Head was out with the crew, pre-gaming and getting food. He openly admitted to everyone that he'd slept with Fiona that night. Rick and Fiona are still together, and I miss Rick a lot. Story 23. I was stationed at Fort Knox, Kentucky, in the late 80s when a soldier's child went missing. Nearly every soldier on base joined the search, combing through every possible area for days. Despite our efforts, the child was never found. Eventually, I left Fort Knox and moved on with my career. Several years later, I was sent back to the base. One day, I noticed a surge of police activity at a park several miles away. That's when the truth finally came to light. The missing girl had been found. Well, what was left of her? It turned out that her stepmother had offed her. When the soldier came home and discovered what had happened, instead of reporting it, he hid the body in the park. The case was only solved because the girl's older sister began to fear she might be next. She confided in a teacher, who then contacted the police. In over 20 years in the Army, I saw plenty, infidelity, scandals, and all kinds of chaos. But nothing ever compared to that. Story 24. I noticed a young airman without a belt and asked him why he wasn't wearing one. He told me he couldn't afford it, so I handed him $5 and told him to go buy one. A few weeks later, I saw him at Ruby Tuesday bussing tables. Curious, I asked around and found out what had happened. His wife had been growing weed in base housing, and as a result, he had been kicked out of the military. He swore he had no idea what she was doing. Story 25. I had a bizarre encounter in a Home Depot parking lot when I was confronted by a dependa over a parking spot. I had parked in a designated veteran's spot. I'm a veteran, had my 2 toddlers with me, and the spot was conveniently next to a cart stall. As I was getting my kids out of the car, a woman approached me. At first, She asked a few casual questions, nothing out of the ordinary. But then she started probing about my veteran status. It felt a little weird, but I answered, I'm a sergeant in the 123rd Transportation Brigade, not real. Part of the National Guard. That's when things took a turn. She smirked and said, well, my husband is a lieutenant colonel, which means he outranks you. I blinked. Well, if he's a commissioned officer, yeah, he already outranks me. So you should give me your spot, she said matter-of-factly. I was dumbfounded. What the actual? I told her to pound sand, which didn't sit well with her. She demanded my name, rank, and unit. Figuring it was pointless to argue, I played along saying, yeah, sure, I'll make sure to save you the spot next time. I thought that was the end of it, until 3 days later when I got a call from my NCOIC. Hey, Sergeant Stuckenpost, do you know a Lieutenant Colonel Buttface? No, should I? Well, he's in my office looking for you. Says it's important. Great. Here we go. My NCOIC put me on speaker, and I braced for a lecture. But instead, the LTC's voice came through the line. Hey, Sergeant, this is Lieutenant Colonel Assface. I just wanted to apologize for my spouse's behavior the other day. I jokingly told her she could parade up and down the street ordering soldiers around. I had no idea she'd take it literally. I'm really sorry about that, and I hope we can put it behind us. I was stunned. A commissioned officer apologizing for their spouse's behavior? That was a first. I accepted his apology, and honestly, chillest LTC I've ever met. Story 26. Back in 2012 or so, I was at the officer club in Okinawa when a group of at least 6 women walked in, all wearing bright orange, cut-off flight suits that looked pretty provocative. I was confused until my Marine friend explained that it meant their husbands were deployed, and they were out looking for a good time. Apparently, it was an open secret. This takes me back to 2003 when I was in the Air Force. A guy's wife started hanging out at the dorms without him. My buddy and I steered clear of her, thinking it wouldn't end well. Turns out we were right. She ended up hooking up with almost every guy in the dorms, even sleeping with a guy in our shop. No kidding. He brought her into the shop, and they banged right on one of our workbenches. In another incident from the early 2000s, I knew a man and his wife, both of whom were active duty. During an altercation, the wife attacked him with an iron skillet. He defended himself, as she was threatening his safety. The cops were called because, well, base housing walls are paper thin. The wife admitted she started it, but the first sergeant pressed charges against the husband. He was found guilty, kicked out of the Air Force, and became a stay-at-home husband while his wife, still in the military, continued her career. She was never charged with anything. Story 27. A man returns from Iraq and starts abusing his wife in an extreme way. Frequent hospital visits and serious injuries. She's in and out of care, but nothing happens legally. Why? It's a military town, with military police, and well, the whole military wife thing. No one steps in. Eventually, during one of his drunken rages, he shoots her. She survives, but just barely. A few months later, the man is found dead in a river, his life taken. Was it due to gang violence? Revenge for what he did to his wife? A fight gone wrong at a bar? It's unclear. It's a military town, and the police there aren't going to dig deep. The wife sets up a memorial for him, but many people decide to stay away. After all, this is the same man who tried to off her. But she spirals emotionally, upset that so many people seem to care more about her than him. In her mind, he was the hero, and somehow, she was to blame. So yeah, military wives, right? Story 28. I was deployed to Iraq, and at the time, I had a fiancée back home. Things were going okay, but then, out of nowhere, she called off the engagement. She told me that I was too controlling. At first, I didn't quite understand what she meant by that, but eventually, I realized she was referring to me not wanting her to go to bars and dance topless. Apparently, that was considered controlling in her eyes. What made the situation even more frustrating was that, after the breakup, I found out she had already been seeing another soldier from a different unit. Looking back, it became pretty clear that it probably wouldn't have been a happy marriage anyway. I guess we just weren't meant to be. Sometimes, things work out the way they're supposed to, even if it's not how you imagined at the time. Story 29. My sergeant's wife still needed to become a legal citizen when we deployed. While we were away, she got arrested for selling alcohol to an undercover cop, yay for manufactured crimes. So, while we're all deployed, my sergeant and most of the command spent extra time and energy battling the legal system to prevent her from being deported back to Mexico, now that she was a criminal and had overstayed her work visa. After a lot of effort and fighting, my sergeant and the command eventually won, and his wife got to stay in the country and pursue citizenship. Fast forward 2 months, and it comes out that his wife's brother was actually her boyfriend. And for years, my sergeant's daughter had been calling this guy uncle. Turns out the wife's family knew the daughter actually belonged to the boyfriend, who was also in the country illegally, but they kept quiet so that my sergeant would claim her as his own, making her a U.S. citizen and helping the wife with her citizenship process. So, this whole situation, this woman, her boyfriend, and her entire family, was part of a plan to get her citizenship through an active duty Marine. I'm not saying they planned the conception, but they definitely took advantage of the opportunity. In my eyes, they're all pretty low, and I really hope the daughter never learns the truth. To this day, my sergeant is in complete denial about the daughter not being his. He believes his wife simply cheated on him, forgave her, and they're still married 8 years later. Story 30. My husband is in the Army, and we live on the base. Our neighbor regularly beats the crap out of his wife. When we first moved in, before we knew about the abuse, we had them over for drinks, and he started bragging about how much his first sergeant loves him. He literally said, "I could do anything to her, and no one would do anything about it because they frigging love me." I've personally called the MPs multiple times, but every time he came home after spending a few days in the barracks, nothing ever happened. Before he left for deployment, she practically lived at our house to escape his abuse. They're in their mid-20s, living in Alaska with no family nearby, and she had nowhere to go. She was terrified to leave him. Now that he's deployed, I've been helping her pack up her things so she can leave before he comes back. She even has a job lined up in the lower 48. Most of the stories we hear are about women cheating or overspending, but not many talk about how abusive some soldiers can be. Story 31. In 2010, I was stationed with an F-18 Squadron, and about a few months into our deployment, things started to go south. Our night shift supervisor in power plants, a female E6, began an affair with a male E7, a maintenance control chief on the same shift. Both of them were married, but neither bothered trying to keep it quiet. Night shift maintenance fell apart. Power plants and maintenance control couldn't get along at all, and every night was a mess. Work slowed to a crawl, mistakes piled up, and communication broke down, which of course directly impacted day shift, the flight schedule, and our mission. Everyone tried reporting the issues through every available channel, but nothing changed. Eventually, dozens of us decided to write to the Inspector General, IG. The IG took action, and investigators showed up on day one, interviewing everyone without holding back because, frankly, nobody liked those two. That same day, they went to interview the female supervisor in her room during her off shift. Surprise, surprise, they catch her in bed with a different night shift maintenance control chief. Turns out, it was our other married chief, who'd also been in on the affair. The original chief went down with them. All three of them were knowingly involved in this messed up love triangle. The female supervisor, who had just been promoted to E6, got busted down to E4 and put on restriction. One chief had just enough time to make an early retirement. The other, however, wasn't eligible for early retirement, despite making chief early in his career. He got busted down to E6 and was sent back to the fleet. But the story doesn't end there. The female E4, now on restriction, managed to get access to Facebook and started posting pity party nonsense and messaging people in the squadron who never liked her. They reported her, and another investigation followed. It turned out she started sleeping with the guy in charge of supervising the restriction barracks. She got busted down again, this time to airmen, and added more days to her restriction and loss of pay. In the end, she was kicked out. She left with the nickname Rings and Rank, which made a lot of sense, considering how she got ahead. Honestly, it was hard to understand any of it, especially since she wasn't attractive at all and was seriously overweight. Story 32. When I first got to my duty station at Drum, my roommate was quite the character. He slept with another soldier's wife from the same platoon. The husband found out, got completely hammered, and was planning to come to the barracks and shoot him. I was the only one in the room that night, and luckily, the guy passed out in his car with the engine running and his foot still on the gas. Nothing ended up happening to either of them. Then, we had this one guy who just couldn't get anything right. He showed up to a rotation at JRTC at Fort Polk with absolutely nothing from his packing list. He ended up getting scabies, so he had to wash everything he brought with him, which wasn't much to begin with. We all got chewed out because we didn't look out for our battle buddy. Lastly, we had a female soldier who got pregnant to avoid deploying to Afghanistan. But our orders got changed, and instead of Afghanistan, we ended up going to Iraq. And of course, she had to come along. Story 33. On my first deployment, we had a comm guy who was about as sharp as a bag of hammers, and his wife wasn't much better. We didn't have regular communication with home, So when we had phone or internet access, it was a big deal. One of those days, he came in all excited, saying his wife told him she was 3 months pregnant, even though we were already 4 months into the deployment. He went around telling everyone, all excited, and I don't think anyone had the heart to point out the math problem. We get back from deployment, and when his son was born, he didn't quite look like what we had all expected. His wife was Mexican, so I guess that was enough for him to convince himself everything was fine. Story 34. On my last deployment, I decided to re-enlist for 3 more years and received a $35,000 bonus for doing so. Since I was overseas, it was considered non-taxable income, which was a nice little perk. I came back home, expecting to enjoy my time and the rewards of the bonus, but life had a different plan for me. Shortly after returning, I was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. It hit me like a ton of bricks, and I immediately had to focus on my health, starting a grueling round of chemotherapy. 3 days after I completed my last chemo treatment, I found out the truth. She told me, casually, that she had been cheating on me the entire time I was deployed and sick. On top of that, she had drained all of my pay, including the bonus, and even sold my truck without my consent. She was a therapist, by the way. Story 35. This happened in 2004, right after we got back from the Iraq invasion. We had just landed in Bangor, Maine, and some veterans had donated cell phones so we could call our loved ones and let them know we were just hours away from reuniting. One sergeant, who'd been calm and collected throughout the entire deployment, called his wife. Everything seemed fine. There were no issues, until there were. We heard this string of cursing, and it was clear this wasn't just any ordinary angry outburst. It was the kind only an infantryman could produce. The phone went flying across the terminal like a missile. Turns out, his wife had waited until he was just a few hours from home, after a year of combat, to drop the bomb. She was divorcing him. To add insult to injury, she had drained his bank account by a few $100 and left all of his stuff in trash bags in his truck. His old, beat-up beater that was parked in the barracks lot, unsecured and unlocked. Within 2 months, he was remarried. It was a messy situation all around, and no one came out looking particularly good. The only silver lining? No animals were harmed in the process, and no coat hangers were involved. Story 36. A friend of mine got married right after high school, then went straight to boot camp and deployed not long after. He gave his wife power of attorney while he was gone. In just 8 months, she completely wrecked his credit and put him $200,000 in debt. They ended up getting divorced, but his commanding officer told him to just give her whatever she wants to keep her quiet. So now, on top of everything else, he's also paying alimony. It's a tough situation because he only joined the military to pay for college, but now he's worried he won't even be able to afford it, even with the GI Bill. Story 37. So back in 2004, I was deployed to Iraq. One day, I get a FedEx box from my wife of 8 years, who was also in the Navy. Inside was a note that simply read, "Your dog died," paperclipped to a picture of my 7-year-old Queensland heeler. Under that photo were the divorce papers, already signed and filled out without my presence or knowledge. She had full power of attorney. When I came back after 18 months, thanks to stop loss, I found a storage shed that had been picked clean by her relatives and only about $12,000 in savings. It should have been closer to $80,000, but she took her half. Apparently, she had fallen in love while on a cruise and decided it was best to just cut ties and move on. So, she packed up everything, moved out, and stuffed a 3-bedroom home's worth of stuff into a 10-by-10 U-Haul storage unit, which I ended up paying for with my credit card for over a year. The value of all that stuff? Maybe $500 worth of furniture. Yeah, being married while in the service was fantastic. Story 38. This happened a while back when I was in the Marines, and it's still a big reason why I struggle with trusting people in general. At the time, I was a LCPL, working in admin. One day, my OIC pulled me aside and brought me into another room with my gunny in the personnel office. They introduced me to this EOD guy who had just returned from a 12-month deployment in Afghanistan. He'd been promoted and re-enlisted while overseas. And for those who don't know, if you re-enlist while deployed, it's considered tax-free income. His re-enlistment bonus for EOD and SSGT was $80,000. He had a wife and 3 kids, but I don't know much about their relationship before this. He seemed like a laid-back, average guy when we talked. But 3 weeks before he came back, his wife packed up and left with the kids, moving back to the States. She drained all of his money and put him $10,000 in credit card debt. On top of that, she had been sleeping with every single person in his shop, the whole 6-person detachment on the other side of the base, including 5 guys and 1 woman. I didn't even know this small detachment existed until he came in. To make matters worse, due to the timing, when he returned, he had been getting too much money from benefits, so we were going to have to dock his pay by another $2,000 to $3,000. I don't remember the exact amount. Long story short, my OIC and the personnel office did some behind-the-scenes work to stop his pay from being docked. But he still lost his $80,000 tax-free bonus and ended up $10,000 in debt, with no idea where his wife and kids were. To top it off, he had to work in a shop where pretty much everyone had slept with his wife. I felt horrible for the guy, and hearing stories like this is one thing, but seeing it firsthand really shook me. It felt like we did the bare minimum to help him, but it was still a crap situation. There's no harder way to get screwed than getting hit with the big green weenie. Needless to say, after seeing all that, I didn't try to start any relationships during my last 2 years in service. Story 39. I was in the Army when my first wife, whom I had been separated from for about 2 years, passed away. She had a life insurance policy worth $100,000, which I put in savings. Not long after, a woman I had known for years came back into my life. We reconnected, grew close, and eventually got married. Shortly after that, I deployed to Iraq. When deployed, soldiers earn additional pay on top of their regular wages, and no taxes are taken out, so even as a lower enlisted guy, I managed to pull in around $50,000 over my 15-month deployment. On top of that, I re-enlisted and received a $20,000 tax-free bonus. Looking back, I was young and trusting, and I gave my new wife a general power of attorney so she could manage things back home without issues. Well, she had some affairs, all right. After putting the pieces together from bank statements and receipts, I learned that for those 15 months, she lived like a rock star. She went out to clubs every night, not only covering her own drinks but also buying drinks for others. She even paid for other guys' car payments on multiple occasions. Money transfers and ATM withdrawals were a daily occurrence, while I was stuck in a place with limited internet access and had no idea my accounts were being drained. To make matters worse, she told me she had cancer and was undergoing chemotherapy, which turned out to be a lie. She just shaved her head, probably to get sympathy from people. By the time I returned home, she had sold all our furniture, moved into a tiny one-bedroom apartment, and bought new furniture using some of the worst financing deals I've ever seen. My bank accounts had about $200 in them, and I had to take out a payday loan just to afford the drive home to see my family. Army regulations were even worse. Since we were still married, she was entitled to my monthly housing allowance, but because of that, I couldn't stay in the barracks. She refused to sign divorce papers, so I had to couch surf for 18 months while I waited for the divorce to process, sending certified mail, proving it was refused, posting notices at the courthouse, and all the other bureaucratic nonsense. Creditors started coming after me for years after that, as she had stopped paying rent and utilities at her old apartment and moved to another place. Eventually, I had no choice but to file for bankruptcy. It's only now that my credit score is back above 700. It was a tough lesson in trust and responsibility, and honestly, it took a long time to recover from everything. Story 40. I have so many stories from my time working as a nurse in the military, particularly in the psych ward, where we had a term for spouses, male or female, who caused trouble, hags. There was this one guy who came back from deployment to find out that his wife and her adult daughters, his stepdaughters, had been running a club right in their house. On base. In office housing, no less. He lost it, grabbed the cash drawer, and tried to drive off in their Corvette. In the chaos, he ran over his wife, who had been trying to block the driveway. She was the patient that day, and as we checked her in, she screamed, "He essayed me," the whole time. It was more figurative than literal, but the whole scene worked in her favor and drew a lot of attention. Then there was another wife, whose daughter was super hot but also developmentally delayed. She had the body of a model, but the face of a horse. The mom, instead of protecting her, basically sold her to enlisted guys in the barracks for a quick go, or a little less to just watch. The mom also liked to pick up younger guys and buy their attention with drugs and booze. She and her daughter were thrown off the base more than once. When they were caught for public intoxication, they'd claim their slurring and the smell of alcohol was because of their diabetes. We had to turn them over to the sheriffs each time. Another wife had a disastrous night on the wrong side of the base, where she didn't belong. Whether it was the enlisted or officer side, I'm not sure. She had been drinking and ended up running over a military member who was passed out in the road. She ripped off one of his limbs, then called 911 hours later, claiming she might have hit a bag of trash at 1 a.m. She didn't realize the severity of what had happened. When the guy came in, he was in excruciating pain, making noises I'll never forget. He survived and kept his limb. The wife went to jail for felony hit and run, and her husband, guess where he was? Overseas. I also had this couple who were total outliers. They shaved their kids' heads, even the girls, and named them after notorious figures like Manson and Satan. They claimed they were devil worshippers, and one of them would be sacrificed to Satan, or so they said. CPS got involved, and the kids were taken away. The husband ended up in the brig for stealing expensive electronics, and the wife came in threatening to off herself, demanding I get her husband out. It was clear that she was unwell, but he was just a jerk. Those poor kids. They didn't deserve any of that. I could go on for days with these stories, paragraph after paragraph. I've got notes, and at one point, I thought about turning them into a book, but there are ethical concerns since they were my patients. I have to be vague because, if someone really wanted to, they could figure out who and where. But honestly, the craziest stuff seemed to happen when people returned from deployment. Whether it was husbands or wives, it didn't matter. There was always a storm waiting to happen when they came back. Here's another one. This one really got to me because the guy was in the hospital trying to get clean after a drug and alcohol binge. He'd gone wild when his wife was deployed, and by the time he realized the depth of what had happened, he admitted it freely. He was genuinely trying to get help before she came home, but he revealed to us that he had this group of partiers squatting in his house while he was gone. They completely trashed the place, stole everything, including his wife's clothes, drove his car into a swamp, and threw the keys into the water. When they came to visit him in the hospital, he was so distraught, but they wouldn't leave. We had to call the cops. As they were leaving, they mooned us, and one of them ended up puking, passing out in the elevator, and cracking his head open. What a mess. Before I joined the military, I remember hanging out at a guy's apartment on Friday nights, which was our usual routine. The girls would drink, while the guys were busy with D&D. One night, a girl from a couple of floors up and her friend joined us. They invited us upstairs, and what we walked into was absolutely shocking. The apartment was completely empty except for garbage. It was beyond disgusting. There were holes in the walls, and the floors had feces and urine all over them. Rotten food and takeout trash piled up everywhere. It was honestly the kind of place you wouldn't want to step foot in. She told us her husband was due back from deployment the next day. What really hit me was that she was taking everything, their kid, all their stuff, and emptied the bank account, leaving him with this filthy, unpaid rent apartment. She claimed he had no idea this was coming. He was totally blindsided. That whole experience gave me a lot of perspective, especially when I saw how some guys would completely lose their minds when they came back from deployment. Some people, like this woman, can really do a number on someone. I've seen it go both ways. Guys can do just as much damage, but I had no idea people could be so cold and malicious during a breakup. If you're going to leave, just leave. Don't destroy the other person's life by setting them up in such a horrible situation. If it's gotten abusive, just call the cops, pack up, and leave. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.